Julia Deans, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Matt and Kevin, and a huge thanks to the City Centre and Market Prosperity and the Urban Studies program for doing this and for creating partnerships with other parts of the country as well. We do a lot of work in partnership, and it's great to see that happening on such an important topic, and may it continue and may more of us get involved in the effort. It's really lovely to be also here at Innis. Thank you very much. As I was saying, we've had a stream of wonderful interns from the Urban Studies program and hired a number of them, and some of them are here today. And so thank you to Innis for being our pipeline. I think the numbers really speak for themselves. To me, it looks like anywhere from 75% to 95% of everything but cows and pigs is working, living, or being created in our metro areas. Those metro areas really are the engines of Canada, the economic engines, and Toronto region is by far the biggest. But you really wouldn't know it from the voice that metro areas have in federal politics. As Kevin said, our votes count for less than other people's votes. It's pretty stark when you look at PEI. It's probably 3 to 2 really for other parts of the country, but still, it has an impact on what gets talked about in Parliament. And I was talking earlier with Alan Broadbent about this session, and he said, you know, Joe Barrage did a study a few years ago, and he actually looked at urban terms and rural terms that were used in Parliament, and it was the difference was something like 1 to 50. So for every urban term, there was 50 rural terms around fences or stockyards or whatever they talk about. But it is telling. It's not, you know, it does tell you that the votes do get represented in the dialogue. So we've had efforts to organize a national voice around urban issues, and probably the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is the biggest effort. It's always faced challenges, though. How do you represent the needs of a little tiny town in northern Alberta, and when you're also talking about the needs of a big city like Toronto or Vancouver? I think that they've done a pretty admirable job, particularly recently, and if you haven't seen it, the FCM put out a really good electoral platform last week for cities, and it's really an excellent piece of work. But at the end of the day, cities also compete with one another. We all know about you know, trying to compete for Olympic Games or what have you. So we often get put in our places by federal interests because they can say, well, we don't want to do something for you because they get mad. And we just have to keep moving towards more partnership and getting the voices heard that are calling for these urban issues to be heard of. There are a number of issues that matter to all Canadians, but are particularly acute for cities. We could talk about a lot of them. Income security is one that certainly matters to all Canadians, but really hits cities like Toronto quite hard. We have a lot of people who don't earn enough money to live properly, and a lot of them are working full-time, and that's really not acceptable. And most of those people live in cities. So it really is a city issue. It's a big issue for Ontario. And all Canadians need to be looking to the federal government to do something to reform EI and other income support systems to make sure that we're using every citizen and resident productively. We also need to be talking a little bit more about the environment. And I think we're now seeing everybody from the councils of chief executives to others saying we need a national policy on carbon pricing. And until we do that, a lot of the things that people in this room and we do to try and improve the environmental situation aren't going to succeed. And we could talk about how do you treat cities where you hold a G8 summit, and how do you compensate those people. And I know there are some people in this room who are really smarting over getting 2 cents on the dollar for the damages they suffered during that period last summer. But let's focus on some issues that are urban issues and that are really not hitting, have not hit the federal agenda in a sustained way. Infrastructure and immigration. The new report that came out today calls for a national cities agenda, and I'd be happy if we even got a national infrastructure agenda. We are the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a national housing strategy or a national transportation strategy. The federal government has long resisted playing a sustained role on these issues, citing constitutional concerns. And it says that they're provincial issues, so they've dabbled, but there's not been a long-term sustained commitment. The truth is that these are issues that are absolutely central to our long-term sustainable or social and economic prosperity as a country, and therefore they have to have federal leadership. The FCM report I referred to, I think, said that the municipal infrastructure deficit right now is about $123 billion. And a big part of that is transportation. And I'm sure if I asked each of you, you would nod your head if transportation's in your top 2 or 3 of issues that you worry about in the Toronto region. With my colleague Micheline Leflesh and others, we held our summit. About 1,000 people were at that. 1,000 people participated before. And transportation was really at the top of the list of almost everybody's agenda, whether they were in business or trying to work with people who are aging, people who are trying to get to work, whatever it was. In the GTA, it actually costs us about $6 billion a year, congestion. And if you think in the next 15 years, we're going to have 2 million more people in the region and 1 million more cars. So if we don't get a really good move on with the big move, the regional transportation plan, we're going to see congestion costing us $15 billion a year by about 2031. So we have a provincial government that's really moved this ahead, and they've pledged about $10 billion of the $50 billion cost of the Big Move Regional Transportation Plan. And they're now, Metrolinx is now working to create a funding plan, and the federal government has to have a role in that. Our work shows that people recognize that our governments don't have endless money bags to pull on, and they're willing to pay costs themselves if it will help to get things moving. So we've seen some support for things like a regional gas tax and road tolls, but every person says there also has to be a federal transportation agreement in place that will help support transit and transportation in the region. So we really do, we need a national transit strategy. So do our fellow city dwellers in Halifax and Montreal and other Canadian cities. We need hard goals on things like transit ridership and commuting times and real options for walking and biking and other active transportation options. And we absolutely need that funding commitment. And we think here it's probably about $2 billion a year. The other area of infrastructure in which we have no national strategy is housing. The federal government recently put in about $500 million into housing through the stimulus fund. But the 3 main programs that the feds have long used to fund housing have expired. And, March 31, the funding is still coming out, but they haven't been renewed. So at the moment there's the prospect of no federal provincial housing policies. And this is particularly important here. We have about 300,000 people living in the GTA alone who are living in homes that are too small or are run down or just too expensive. And you probably all know as well as me that the cost to rent or buy a home are increasing. People aren't building low-rent apartments right now, and most of the construction is really for owned homes that are out of the reach of most people. There's a big increase in the number of people reaching out to food and rent banks, and there are 88,000 people on the list for social housing. And if you can believe it, the waiting list for that is 2.5 years to 21 years. I actually had a shiver go down through me. It's such a shocking thing to imagine. These people need a decent place to live, and we need that too. This is a cost to it's a cost to Toronto, it's a cost to Ontario, it's a cost to Canada when you have people who are not living properly and are unable to live productively as well. So we need a federal housing strategy, and we've long needed this strategy, one that sets national goals on housing creation and affordability, and puts in place long-term sustainable funding flows to ensure that these goals get realized. And again, so do our fellow city dwellers in Edmonton and Fredericton and St. John's. The other area that I'd like to touch on is immigration. And we in Toronto are probably more aware of this than others because we are a city that's almost 50% foreign-born. But immigrants have really built this entire country and are the key to our future economic growth. I think Kevin's statistics pointed to immigration being that's going to be our population growth, but it's also our economic growth. It's also a huge advantage that we have in Canada, and in particular here. It really sets us apart from every other part of the world. And I think I've probably been boring my colleagues and other people by talking about some work I've done with new colleagues in Europe. And in Europe, people from Germany will talk about third-generation migrants. And they kept saying this, and I said, who are you talking about? What's a third-generation migrant? I realized I'm a second-generation migrant. But the whole mindset we have around immigration here is so positive and it is so welcoming and inclusive. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it's way better than other parts of the world. But we can't be complacent in thinking that other parts of the world aren't looking very hard at Canada and at Toronto and thinking, how do we get some of that too? And in addition, some of the new research shows that other countries are going to be going after the very same migrants that we've been going after. So if we think we're a magnet for immigrants, we shouldn't underestimate its strength, and we need to protect that. The federal government obviously plays a huge role in immigration, but we need them to explicitly recognize how critical immigrants are to the success of our cities. The work that we did for our summit showed that there are a series of stages that go on in bringing immigrants to Canada. It goes from recruiting people in countries very far away to the procedure that they go through to get here, once they land, how they get settled as a family, how they get settled in work, and that really those pieces do not fit together at all well. And I think probably most of you are familiar with the horrible stories you hear about people coming with skills that aren't being deployed. But it really is an issue. We do not have a connection between our labor needs and what's being recruited for overseas. And that's one of the things that really needs to get fixed. We also need a federal government that will properly support immigrants as they settle themselves and their families here and as they integrate into our economy. This includes leveraging things like their entrepreneurial talents, which is something that, a big recommendation that came out of our summit, and we've seen it done in other parts of the world. Barcelona is one example. They have a 24-hour entrepreneur support place that has language services, about 18 different languages. So if you come to Barcelona and you want to set up a business, 3 in the morning, they're there for you. Something we could be doing fairly easily, and we're going to actually be working with some partners to try and do that. The other thing that I've been very surprised to realize is that in Ontario, which has always been the immigrant capital, we're actually getting about 20% fewer immigrants than we have in the past. And the people we're getting are less skilled. So other provinces, they get immigrants, but 25% of them are skilled. Our average is 16%. And we're getting many fewer economic class immigrants. And those are the people who come and create businesses and hire many other people. Part of this is probably because of us. Other people hear about experiences in the Toronto region and they say, well, I'll go try my luck in Vancouver or Alberta. But part of it is also to the immigration agreement that our province has with the federal government, or had, I should say had, because it actually expired March 31st. It got extended by a year, expired March 31st, and the ministers right now aren't talking to each other, which is pretty horrific. And the other provinces have much better immigration agreements, and in fact, they're sort of skimming off a lot of the best people looking at Canada, and they're going directly to other provinces and not coming here. We know that this is a place where we use immigrants well. We have a real need for it, and it's certainly the key to our future economic growth. And we need to have a federal government that recognizes that and that has an agreement with us to protect that, and also funds it. So you can't have lifted up a paper in the last little while or listened to Metro Morning without knowing that funding has been cut for a lot of immigration settlement services. And I think the dollar amount was about $53 million. 80% of it was in Ontario. So we're facing a situation where we have no agreement to govern this, and we certainly can't rely on any future money. And again, this matters to us, but it also matters to other city dwellers, because as Kevin pointed out, cities, metro areas, we're calling metro areas, are home to 90% of Canada's immigrants. So I'm going to close my remarks here. I'm looking around this room, I see people who are far more expert than I am in so many areas, and I'm hoping that in addition to questions, you'll be bringing some perspectives and information that others may not have to the table, and I thank you very much.